Kia ora, good afternoon everyone. So I'm Bruno. I work as technical lead for the Light Attach program. Today I'm going to take you through an overview of what the Light Attach program has been doing on pesticide resistance with a focus on resistance management. So starting with what resistance management means, especially from a grower's point of view, most of the information available around the management of the resistance risk is available from the product label. So every time you buy an agrochemical product, you do have a label that displays a couple of key information. So you do have the group numbers, which are basically the mode of action. You also have a section on the product label, which is clearly about resistance management. And if you look at this section, you can get some information regarding the maximum number of applications. You can also get a link to get more detailed information, and that link is taking you to a website which is hosted by the New Zealand Plant Protection Society. So that's basically the basic information any grower will access in terms of resistance management. Why ALT, the Light Attach program, has been looking at doing some work on pesticide resistance? That's all the rationale. So basically, we used to say it's in our DNA. As you probably know, the Light Attach program is really focusing on sustainable crop protection, which means over the years, and it's a 7-year program ending next year in March 27. Over the years, we've been developing collaboration across many product groups. We've been developing projects in order to build the skills, the knowledge, but also to evaluate the efficacy, the performance of innovative solutions. So we've been really focusing on the toolbox. And as you know, there's a lot of products, especially the old chemistry, that are being phased out, so no longer available to the growers. And also, based on the current regulatory pathways, it does take many, many years to get new products in the market and new solutions available for the growers. So the starting point is, in the meantime, the growers are left with what's available, with a high risk of overusing some of these chemicals, and then a high risk of developing resistance. That's why we've been focusing on resistance management from day one, trying to develop a collaborative approach, talking to everyone, the crop protection companies, the crop sectors, the scientists, everyone basically having a say on resistance management. So our role, like I just said, is really to facilitate some cross-industry discussion. We've got some challenges. One is we are a 7-year program, which means next year it's the end of ALT. So what's going on after, what will happen post-ALT? The other challenge is we do have a mandate, which is basically on horticulture, arable crops, but so which means we are missing the pastoral sector, which is also critical because they do use some chemicals. What we've been doing from an historical point of view, we've been focused on the strategies. So basically, all the material you access when you visit that web link we've seen on the product label. And it all started in 2021. We had actually a workshop where we identified that 25 strategies need to be updated. MBIE and Ag Research already had a contract to update the herbicide resistance management strategy. So ALT has been supporting the work on updating, reviewing the fungicides and insecticide strategies. This work led to some peer review and uploading the new strategy on the NZPPS website. A year later, in 2025, so after having uploaded these strategies on the website, we actually organized a couple of key events. So last year was a big year for ALT in regards to pesticide resistance management. So we had a symposium at the NZPPS conference where, as you can see, the day was split in a couple of key sessions. Why is it a growing concern? And it is a growing concern. That will refer you to the toolbox situation I described. What solution, what can we do to improve that situation? What are the barriers and what's the long-term opportunities? On top of this symposium, we also organized a workshop. And basically the people who turned up were people from different backgrounds, different organizations, different entities, with the regulators, with the retailers, the registrants, so basically the crop protection companies, and the researchers. That workshop was actually a great opportunity to talk about the strategies, the ones we update a year earlier, to actually identify, do they need further update? Do we need to create new strategies? Do we need to support the growers with new material? We also grabbed the opportunity of having everyone in the room to talk about the resistance surveillance, testing, screening, because we do know that getting access to accurate and reliable data on the resistance status is a key piece of information. And finally, we also talk about education, extension, training, any activities in that space that can support the growers to better understand the pesticide resistance and especially the management guidelines. Just a quick overview of these strategies. I mentioned the New Zealand Plant Protection Society website. This is what it looks like. So that's the current state. We do have 46 strategies. They are basically split in 4 categories that you can see on the top: herbicide, insecticide, miticides, fungicides, and crop-specific strategies. Used to be coordinated by a committee, which is no longer active. And when we scroll this section and when we open all these PDF documents, we can see, and that's a few examples, we can see that they are not standardized. So this one is an example for the aphid resistance management. You can see that there's a nice table with some group numbers, so IRAC group numbers, which is related to the mode of action. The whole thing looks very wordy, and it's not very user-friendly. If we take another example, now in the fungicide space, we've got this one, group 9, same, lots of information, quite bulky. And as you see in this one, there's no mention of any product, not even the active, quite different to the previous one. Still on the fungicide space, another example in the same category. This one has trade names and actives. So what do we see? Obviously, they're not standardized. So at the workshop was a large consensus shared across the room that they do need further review. Even though it's already good stuff, like it's some very interesting and reliable information produced by scientists, they are not fit for purpose in terms of they are not user-friendly. And if they are too wordy, the growers are not likely to adopt them, to read them. So that's the main challenge. We then had group discussion regarding, okay, what information do we want to see in these strategies? What is relevant to the grower? So is it about biology of the pest, of the pathogen? Is it about some guidelines, IPM principles? Is it about the mode of action? So we had this discussion at the workshop. And eventually we want to standardize as much as possible to make them, like I said, users-friendly, growers-friendly. Going through the process of discussing the format and the content, because both needs to be updated, we organize sessions. So after the workshop, we actually create some working groups. We discuss what sections we want to see. We also explore the international model. Obviously, it's pesticide resistance is a global issue around the world, and there are some countries that are more advanced in that case. So we explored the benchmark. We got actually a good example with a connection to our colleagues in the UK. This is an example about what they did on botrytis. And like I said before, the resistance status is a key piece of information which is displayed in their strategies over there. So we look at what's done overseas, and obviously we do know that any guidelines, any management, any management guidelines or support will need to be adapted to our New Zealand conditions. Goals, as you can read here: consistent, structure, update, and grower friendly. So we've been working with a contractor since these working group sessions to update the existing material. So we're not going to update the 46 as one go, but we've been focusing on developing templates to standardize the herbicide, insecticide, fungicide strategies. And these are examples about what's coming up next. So as you can see, and I'm more than open to get your feedback, we aim at having something which is clear, which is concise, with some visuals, so some icons, some stamps. This is an example of the fungicide strategy. On the front page, you do have the crops on which the strategy can be applied to, and also some information on the available products, trade names, actives. Another example about the herbicide. So this is about the group 5 herbicides. There's some highlights and some indication regarding what groups, what herbicides, what actives are actually at high risk of resistance. So from a grower's point of view, it does give some very useful information and good insights. This is about insecticide resistance management strategy. Again, some key information at the front page, including the key principles, what are the best practices in terms of resistance management, and you also have some breakdown based on the guidelines. What can I do in terms of crop management? What can I do in terms of shelter management, insecticide use? So this is basically what we've been working on. Today I'm just sharing draft because the delivery of the whole work is actually next month. So this is one subtopic out of the resistance management. We talk about the strategies, that's the core focus of ALT. But as you've seen before, resistance surveillance is also a key piece of work. At the workshop and in our previous conversation, everyone agrees it's critical and testing is crucial because pesticide resistance obviously varies and obviously it does build up over time, even more when you're left with a limited number of options. So the ongoing testing is crucial. We don't even know if this is happening currently in New Zealand. So that's the starting point. What is the current situation? Who's doing what? Do we actually test for resistance on a regular basis? So if we look at the available data, and some of his work's been supported by ALT in the last 6 years, as you see, there's some work that happened from different product groups. This one is from Bragato in the wine industry. Ag Research, they work with FAR on the arable crops, on screening the herbicide resistance, having some very useful information, what regions are at risk. We've got some publication from FAR also in the herbicide space. Boysenberry's New Zealand, they did some work on actually fungicide resistance for botrytis control on boysenberries. And there's many examples. This is another one from the science and some science research institute on insecticide resistance. So sounds like there's lots of work, or there's some work happening, but it's pretty much happening in silos. We don't really have an overview of what's going on there. And we know that we need access, we need to have that information available and to include this information in any resources, starting with the strategies for the growers. So we also developed a contract, and we did contract this piece of work. So the scope is basically to identify who does work on resistance surveillance, so and who does what. How this is achieved? Do they use very high-tech equipment? Is it expensive? We want really to have an overview of what's going on there. It's still underway with an ETA in the next couple of months. But basically, the first findings through this analysis is that it's mostly levy-funded by the product groups and the crop sectors. There's different levels of investments, so it's quite patchy in that regard. There was actually a very large project, the one I mentioned before, on herbicide resistance, supported by Ag Research and MBIE. Otherwise, the challenge so far, when we gather the cost, is about the cost of doing this work. It's very expensive, and it's also what we can describe as a ad hoc regime, which means it's always like a one-off. It doesn't happen as an ongoing thing. It's one sector saying, red flag, we probably have an issue there. Can we actually spend $20,000, $50,000 on some resistance screening? So there's no ongoing consistent initiatives. And it does also rely on small specialist teams. So the people, the resource to achieve this work, which is quite technical, is limited in our country. So next month we should have the report, which will be a proper landscape map of what happened on resistance surveillance. Finally, the third part is really about education extension. As I said before, the issue is massive. Like we're already in the world where we already know there are lots of solutions that are no longer effective in terms of pest control or disease control because of resistance, which means we really need to develop some resources, some information for the sectors. So we are working on developing some case studies by sector, and we do interact with 13 product groups. We also want to develop some fact sheets. So this is about the basic knowledge, the basic message on resistance. What is resistance? What is a mode of action? What is a group number? All the basic knowledge, because you'll be surprised, a lot of people don't always understand these numbers. So it sounds simple, actually it's not. And actually it's critical to carry on with the extension work in that space. And finally, we're developing some resources around the resistance management practices. It's really about, through all the case studies, it's very interesting to share what works, so to share the success and the failures. So when you talk to a crop sector, it's pretty interesting and relevant to talk about the outcome of the previous work and highlighting why it worked, why it didn't work. So this toolkit is likely to be delivered in a couple of months. And there's another piece of work, another contract, which is related to extension and education, is what we call the counterfactual analysis. So we are working with the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. A lot of time through our group discussions, workshop, we were all wondering how much it does cost the New Zealand horticulture and arable sectors for not doing anything on pesticide resistance. Basically, how much do we lose from pesticide resistance? It's a big question. We are trying to work with some experts in modeling, in actually getting to understand the consequences of not doing anything through a framework. And this is the scope of work. Eventually, we'll get a clear counterfactual analysis which will reflect what is likely to happen also in terms of cost for not having a coordinated approach, a country-wide approach on resistance management. This report is likely to support two draft activities and something we'll like to do within the next 12 months, so before the end of ALT, is actually campaigns to raise the awareness from the growers to actually identify pesticide resistance as a major risk. And you can see it's actually, factually, it's a big risk, but it doesn't show up a lot in our conversation when you interact with people from the industry. But the risk is there, and it's a high risk. The second campaign will be around education extension to support basically key people from the industry, starting with the growers, on the knowledge, the basic knowledge I mentioned before. And there's a clear focus on the crop advisors and the retailers as well. Because when you buy an agrochemical from a store, there's no requirement for the guy who's selling you the product to have any qualification or any awareness on pesticide resistance. So it can't really deliver you a message around the best way to manage the risk if there's no specific requirements. So we want to upskill the industry by providing some key resources. And that's due next May. So basically, to recap my presentation, ALT has been working from day one on resistance management, but pre-ALT, the committee was no longer active, so limited activity in the previous years. We've been focused on the resistance management strategies, which is so far the only material which is available when you visit the New Zealand Plant Protection Society website. In 2025, we've been very busy with a couple of cross-industry events, some group conversation, symposium, workshop, working groups. And these events, all the conversations that happened in 25, really help us to come up with a strategy and all the activities I've mentioned before. So the next step is to get all these activities to deliver reports, resources. So I talk about the templates that should be eventually more user-friendly. There's also the resistance surveillance mapping. Who's doing what? How much does it cost? The resources, including the case studies, the fact sheets, and eventually the nice report we're expecting from the Economic Research Institute. Now, long-term, post-ALT. So ALT is really that neutral body, partly funded by MPI, partly funded by the crop sectors. So we are neutral. We are a neutral body. We are not advocating for any of the parties. Post-ALT, who's going to take this on board? We do know has to be an ongoing thing. Like the sectors, they need to carry on with updating the strategies. We need to update the resistance status on a regular basis. So what we are doing, we're basically working on the foundation of a system that will need to be passed on and handed over to what we call a unified governance body or a central entity. The funding of all these activities, especially I mentioned the high cost of doing some work on surveillance, can be addressed by getting a levy fund, so a levy fund model. In that case, we actually had nice discussion with a dedicated working group on funding with the guys involved in the agri-recovery model. So something like that to actually sustain the investment and to make sure you have ongoing funding. And as far as we went, like through all this conversation, AFANS, which is basically the industry body for the crop protection companies, is well placed to lead such a national program on resistance management. We keep referring to AFANS because overseas, especially in Australia, this work of like coordination is achieved by CropLife, which is the equivalent of AFANS over there. And it's very similar in Europe as well. So yeah, a little bit of unknown regarding the future, but for sure from an ALT point of view, we're going to deliver as much as we can. If we don't do it, no one's going to do it now, and it's still it's likely to remain patchy. So we just want to push to do as much as we can. We've got a dedicated budget. We'll probably spend it all eventually, but long term, still some discussions to happen in the next few months. I invite you to sign up to our newsletter and obviously to visit our website because we're updating the website regularly. So you can get access to the latest updates, developments, especially on resistance management. But basically watch this space because yeah, we are going to deliver some good information for the sectors. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions.